Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the latest Zoom meeting of the Irish Astronomical Association. Normally, we would be in the Bell Lecture Theatre, thanks to the Astronomical Research Centre staff and students who provide us with a fortnightly position in the theatre. We look forward to getting back to that in good time. For anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Danny Collins. I'm the present honorary president of the association, ably assisted by my VP, Dr. Andy McRae, who is also editor of our quarterly magazine, which is one of the main benefits of our membership. Still at £20 individual, £25 family, and I believe it's 25 and 30 euros respectively for our guests from the south. Also, our inimitable webmaster, Paul Evans, who also does a monthly short What's in the Sky thing on YouTube and also on our website, irishastro.org. And our even more inimitable PR officer, Terry Mosley, who knows just about everybody in astronomy, for which we were very grateful. And the rest of our council who help in various different ways. Sadly, we're losing one member, the recent joiner, Adam. He is finding not enough time for all the things in his life, but he may rejoin us. Just a few Sky notes, and then we shall go on to our main speaker, John Flannery. Paul Evans also kindly reminded me something I saw in connection with Dara O'Brien's forthcoming appearance at Armagh Planetarium. For a while, it looked like they'd completely sold out, but they've discovered a bit more Zoom time. So there are 100 seats, or there were, last time I checked, fresh seats, fresh spaces available if you wish to apply again. Okay, what's up in the sky at the moment? Friday coming, we have a nice grouping of Mars, current crescent moon. Where's my notes? Mars, the moon, Aldebaran, Hyades, and the Pleiades, which I believe you could get in a 50mm lens on a DSLR. That would make a lovely shot. Following that, Saturday, I'd forgotten, the sun will be putting us into the spring or vernal equinox. That's Saturday the 20th, 9:37. And our old friends, the lunar X and V Claire obscure effects, are visible at 23:15 on the evening of Saturday. I've seen some lovely images of that. If you're not sure where they are, a quick Google will give you quite a good image and or map of the moon. On Friday, Venus reaches superior conjunction, after which the planet will slowly return to the evening sky. Hard to miss, it's obviously so bright. And then Saturday the 28th, the full moon occurs close to lunar perigee, meaning it will appear slightly brighter and fractionally larger than the average moon. And of course, the clocks go forward an hour at 1:01 UT that date to British summertime. That's it until I start looking at the April sky to come next time. John Flannery. John, I've known for quite a while. Most of us have. Hails from Neenah, down in County Tipperary, but has lived in Dublin for a good while, 35 years or so. He develops business software during the day, but has a passion for science outside office hours. Over many years, he has traveled to a number of solar eclipses, and like many on here, me included, he has been frustrated and delighted by events seen and not seen in the skies over Ireland and the rain and the clouds. John's editor of the quarterly journal for our sister association, the Irish Astronomical Society, and is regularly active in astronomy outreach. He writes a monthly column for the Irish Times and on the night sky, and has given many talks at Dunsink Observatory in Dublin. His main interests as an amateur astronomer are the sky lore of world cultures, binocular observing, and astronomical history. His subject tonight is Charles Messier and his catalogue. I'm sure most of you know 250 years ago this year, the French astronomer Charles Messier submitted the first draft of a catalogue that would guarantee him lasting fame, and me about half a dozen books. I'm sure John has more. Now recognized as a list of the sky's showpiece objects, it contains highlights such as the Great Nebula in Orion, M42, the Andromeda Galaxy, M31, and the beautiful Pleiades star cluster, M45. Tonight's talk by John will tell a little about the life of Charles Messier, how his catalogue came into being, and its importance in astronomy. Just one last thing before I hand over. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat button, and we can then refer to them in sequence at the end. Okay, and with that, it's over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Danny, and thanks everyone for the invite. I'll just share, just see, can I share this here?
Yep.
Yeah, can everyone see that there?
Yep.
Perfect. As Danny said, instead of raising a glass tonight to St. Patrick, I'll be toasting a different patron, I guess what you might call the patron saint of deep sky observing, the French astronomer Charles Messier. And the talk will very much cover a lot of, will be very much biographical. We'll cover a lot about his life. And he did live through quite turbulent times. He lived through the period of the French Revolution. He suffered tragedy in his life. But he was a dedicated observer and very much, I guess, amateur astronomer at heart, even though he collaborated with many of the professional astronomers across Europe of the time. So this slide just gives a brief summary of the main parts of the talk tonight. And as amateur astronomers, when we pick up a star atlas and we're trying to find particular objects, or if you're just a beginner to the hobby, you might find it a bit bewildering to see atlases covered in all sorts of labels and various other designations. And some of these are numbers with the prefix N in front of them. And these are what we call Messier objects. They're what observers call deep sky objects, objects that lie beyond the solar system. As Danny said, 250 years ago this year, Messier took the first steps in guaranteeing himself lasting fame by starting to catalogue these particular objects he had seen in the sky. The first draft of the catalogue was submitted on the 16th of February, year 1771. But the story of Messier actually begins on June 26, 1730, when he was the 10th of 12 children born to Francois and Nicolas Messier in a small town of Badonville in what was called the Duchy of Salem. France at the time was very much was ruled by the kings. Like King Louis was king at the time, and right across the country there was various dukedoms and kingdoms, and the country was very much fractured into the basis of royal lineage. The town of Badonville is about 320 kilometers east of Paris, very near the German border, and it's quite a small town. It's only got a population of about 1,600 people at the moment, but it's in quite a picturesque area in the Vosges Mountains. As was common at the time, not all of Messier's siblings survived adulthood. In fact, of the 12 children born to Francois and Nicolas Messier, only 6 lived to adulthood. Messier's family was actually quite well off. their father, the father Nicholas, was a kind of a cross between a mayor and a bailiff, and worked for the duchy and reported directly to the Duke of the kingdom. And as a result, they lived in fairly comfortable circumstances, though with a family at that size, obviously it was going to be hard on occasions, but certainly they didn't have the daily toil that many families would have had at the time. The Messier's father, though, passed away when he was 11 years old, but his brother was 13 years older than Messier. His brother Hyacinthe took over the running of the family. Hyacinthe was an accountant for the duchy, and as a result was able to afford taking over looking after the family. Messier's interest in astronomy, in a sense, was probably sparked by the appearance of a fantastic comet in 1744. It's called de Jesus comet, but it was actually discovered by the Dutch astronomer Klinkenberg. It's named after de Jesus because that Swiss astronomer probably made the most studies of the comet, and as a result, his name became appended to it. By all accounts, it was a very dramatic object. Contemporary drawings show it having 6 tails fanning up from the horizon. The head of the comet was apparently about the same brightness as the planet Jupiter, and it was truly an extraordinary sight for observers. 4 years after the comet appeared, Messier saw a deep partial solar eclipse. The eclipse was actually annular, a bit further east, passing through Central Europe, but from Badonville, it was actually a deep partial. Those 2 events, although they didn't convince Messier to become an astronomer, they certainly would have instilled a deep interest in nature and the world around him in the young Charles. At this stage, Messier was working with his brother Hyacinthe, as Messier himself had suffered an accident when he was 10 years old. He fell out the upstairs window of their house and broke his arm. And as a result, he was taken out of school and essentially given home schooling. Hyacinthe tutored him in the various methods and techniques, accountancy, bookkeeping, draftsmanship, and other practices that would be useful if he went on to take up a position working in the duchy. However, circumstances changed. A reorganization of I guess what you might call the reorganization of France meant that the dukedom lost its independence in the year 1751, and it was later annexed. Well, it became part of the Department of Lorraine, and then was later annexed by France itself. As a result of that, the family circumstances changed, and suddenly the job opportunities that were there for the Messier family no longer existed. As a result, it was decided that Messier would strike out on his own and try and find employment himself. Connections in the family with various parties in Paris meant that a couple of opportunities arose that were of interest to Messier. One was assisting a curator of a palace in the French capital, and the other was working with the astronomer as an assistant to the astronomer of the Navy, who was Joseph Delila. Messier considered both positions, but he decided there was better prospects working as an assistant to the astronomer of the Navy. And in September 1751, he left Badonville and moved to Paris, where he settled in with Delila and his wife, and who were childless and more or less took on the young Messier as a son of their own. Delila had originally spent about 20 years in St. Petersburg working there, and he eventually moved back from there to Paris, where he settled into what a former monastery that was called the Hotel de Cluny. This monastery is now the Museum of the Medieval Age, and it's fairly close to the center of Paris. It's not far from Notre Dame. The first post that Messier took up, well, essentially he got the position not because of his astronomical prowess, but he really got the position, as Delila later said, because of his draftsmanship, his neat handwriting, and his ability to keep records. And his first task given to him by Delila was actually to copy out a huge map of the Great Wall of China that had to be rolled out in an unheated corridor. And Messier set about doing that before he did any astronomical observations. He was assigned various copying tasks, and it was only later that he moved into becoming like getting training or being apprenticed as an astronomer. The Delila had got the position of astronomer of the Navy by virtue of, well, he lectured at the College Royal in Paris. The Hotel de Cluny was separate to the Paris Observatory itself, which meant that Delila could do, well, more or less decide what he wanted to do himself and work on his own projects rather than being ordered to do projects by the director of Paris Observatory. As a result, much of the work that Delila was doing was very much observational focused rather than mathematical calculations. The position of astronomer of the Navy was a token position, really. It was given to him by the Navy on contingent of Delila allowing the Navy use his library and use the observatory. You can see in this drawing here, the observatory that Delila set up is built on the stair tower of the hotel, of the monastery, and it had a reasonable view of the sky from there. A lot of the instruments that were there, like many observatories, the astronomers themselves had to provide them, but some of the instruments nowadays we consider performing no better than pairs of binoculars, and it was really the quality of the instruments at the time, which I might say a bit more about later. One of the tasks, once Messier had graduated to astronomical observations, one of the tasks that Delila assigned to him was to hunt for Comet Halley. Now, Delila had corresponded with Newton and Halley and knew of the importance of recovering the comet which had been predicted to return by Halley. Halley himself, well, it came about with publication in 1705 by a pamphlet by Halley that where he pointed out that a comet seen in the 1600s and 1500s seemed to be the same object. And as a result, Halley predicted that this particular object should return in the year 1758, late 1758 or early 1759. Halley himself knew he wouldn't live until those dates. He passed away in 1742, but he galvanized astronomers around Europe to try and find this particular object and show that there was a link between it and previous objects, and so prove that comets were periodic, that they came around after the same period of time. Delisle had created charts for Halley to search the sky, and Messier started his search in late 1758. In late January 1759, Messier found a comet and was almost certain that it was the comet that astronomers had been waiting for. He told Delisle, but Delisle wasn't convinced. Whether, more than likely, he felt that, well, he more or less told Messier that it wasn't Halley's comet, that it was probably a different comet, and he asked Messier to keep his search up. After a couple of months, Messier, in March 1759, Messier got word that Halley's comet had actually been found on Christmas night 1758 by a German amateur astronomer called Johann Hallich. Hallich immediately became famous for being the first person to recover Halley's, and Messier was very despondent by this because his independent discovery had been covered up by Delisle. Delisle was basically didn't want to admit that his calculations were wrong, and that's why he asked Messier to continue searching. Eventually, on the 1st of April 1759, Delisle told the Academy of Science in France that Messier had found Halley's back in January of that year, but by then it was too late. The damage was done, and the Academy of Science basically didn't believe Delisle. It left Messier very disillusioned, but he soon recovered and vowed to make it his life's work to continue the hunt for cometary objects. When Halley was found, Halley's comet was found, only 50 comets had ever been observed in all of recorded history. So this linking of Halley's comet with previous returns was an extraordinary step for comet discovery. There had been hints that comets potentially rounded the sun previously. Tycho Brahe, for example, the comet of 1577, he observed it and showed that it lay beyond the orbits of some of the planets. And he suspected that they traveled through the solar system, but to Brahe, they traveled in a straight line, that essentially they continued on and headed back out of the solar system again, never to return. Halley was the first to suggest that they were in orbit about the sun, the same as the planets were. And in finding Halley's in the 18th century, it finally showed that, or finally proved that link. Messier, Comet Halley wasn't the first discovery by Messier. He had found the comet back in 1758, but it had been previously found by a different observer. But it was while he was following that particular comet, using charts he had prepared, he stumbled across a faint patch of light in the constellation of Taurus. And carefully noting its position, he found that from night to night, its position was unchanged. And he puzzled over it for a while, but decided that it wasn't a cometary object. And checking back in previous charts, he found that it had previously been discovered by John Bevis in 1731. Again, following another comet, one that he had discovered himself in 1760, Messier stumbled across a second object that appeared to be stationary in the sky. It too wasn't a new discovery. It had been previously found by the astronomer Maraldi in 1746. Messier's first independent find wasn't until 1764 when he found the globular cluster M3 in the constellation Canes Venatici. The Messier's telescopes, the telescopes he used were generally, some of them quite unwieldy. This was the era of chromatic refractors where the quality of the lenses were not very good at all. And some of the instruments compensated by having very long focal lengths. You may have seen drawings previously of the so-called aerial telescopes where the objective was mounted on maybe a pole or something, and the eyepiece was essentially maybe 3, 4, 5, even 10 meters away from the lens itself. And you were constantly trying to align the eyepiece with the lens. And it became very unwieldy, but it was the only way to overcome the terrible chromatic aberration that some of these telescopes suffered. They also had fixed magnification, so to find any of these things, any nebulae and comets in the sky through a telescope of the time was an extraordinary feat. The telescope Messier tended to use were much shorter focal lengths, maybe a meter and a half focal lengths. But again, they used high magnification, maybe 60 to 100 times magnification. He also used a number of reflector telescopes, but they had mirrors made of speculum metal, and again also incorporated fixed magnification. In fact, some of the telescopes Messier used would be no better quality than a good pair of binoculars nowadays. So, and yet they made many of these first discoveries in the sky with these instruments. It was while Messier was observing these objects that he finally began to draw up the idea of compiling a list of particular features in the sky. At this stage, Delisle had retired from being astronomer of the Navy. He retired in 1761, and it freed up Messier's time to pursue various interests of his own, and that included ramping up the amount of sweeps he was making for comets and other objects in the sky. When Messier found M3, he decided to make a serious effort to pulled together observations of all deep sky objects known up to that point. There'd only been a handful of catalogues compiled. Some of the objects have been known from ancient times, like the Beehive cluster in Cancer was known to the ancients. The Pleiades, of course, and there was a few other objects that have been discovered in the intervening 1500 years or so. But Messier was the first to make a systematic search of previous records and pull them all together, including his own observations, and compile them into a catalogue. The compilation of the catalogue was interrupted for a period. Part of his duties, he worked for the Department of, working for the College Royal and the Department of the Navy, involved maybe checking chronometers, and he did a 3-month voyage in the Baltic Sea and along the Dutch coastline testing chronometers with a colleague. But that was the only time he kind of stepped aside from his astronomical duties to do a different project. And he decided being shipboard wasn't for him. But it was like some of the catalogues that Messier pulled together were Denham, an English astronomer. He had translated a catalogue produced by Hevelius. There was a catalogue compiled by Lacaille, who had observed many objects from the southern hemisphere. There was also some other entries I mentioned, like the ones from historic times, pulling all of them together. Over a period of several months, Messier made very detailed observations of each of these, discarded ones that didn't show up as nebulous or comet-like in his instruments, and put them in an appendix to the catalogue. And eventually, about 1769, he had pulled together the majority of the work and then arranged it into a final draft, which he submitted on the 16th of February 1771 to the Academy of Sciences. At this stage, Messier had been elected a member of the Academy of Sciences, which was quite important, because you couldn't correspond with other scientists unless you were a member of various academies. And he had tried for a number of years to become a member of the French Academy of Sciences, but as someone once said, maybe they were still remembered the embarrassing episode of the Halley discovery and decided not to admit him. But by 1770, Messier's fame was known across Europe, and so he became elected a member. He had already become a member of other academies 6 years prior to that, but the French Academy had held out for a period of time before finally admitting him. The interesting thing about the catalogue, the first draft, about 17 of the entries are Messier's own discoveries. All the rest were found by other observers. He also, when he completed the catalogue, he had only 41 objects. The last entry being the Messier 41, which he had found himself, open cluster below the star Sirius. But he decided to add 4 more objects to bring it up to 45. And that's where it introduces a number of puzzles. the objects he added to the initial list of 41 to bring it up to 45 were well-known, relatively well-known objects. The Beehive cluster had been known since ancient times, so were the Pleiades. The Orion Nebula was found in 1610. And you also would, like, the idea of the catalogue was to identify objects that would not be mistaken for comets. The Pleiades, impossible to mistake for a comet. You can see individual stars. So why was it included? Why was the double cluster in Perseus omitted? And there's been much debate over these various various reasons why these objects would not be why they're included and why other stuff was omitted. Basically, Messier one suggestion was the number of objects was 45 because Lacaille's catalogue had numbered 42, and Messier rounded it up to 45, so he would have more than one of his contemporaries had compiled. But that doesn't really hold water because many of Lacaille's objects are not visible from Paris. They're too far south in the sky to be visible from Paris. More than likely, he included the Orion Nebula, the Beehive cluster, and the Pleiades because in his instruments, these objects would have appeared cometary, and also two of his comet discoveries that he had made himself had been discovered with the naked eye. When the Pleiades is low on the horizon, it's very possible that it may look cometary to the unaided eye, and certainly when some of the discoveries of the time of comets were solely made with the naked eye, then there was a way of distinguishing the Pleiades from these temporary visitors to our skies. More than likely, though, the Pleiades were included because only one star has a designation. The brightest star in the Pleiades is Eta Tauri. The Beehive probably included because, again, it would look cometary in the type of telescope that Messier would have used. When I was doing up the talk originally, one suggestion I came across as to why the double cluster was omitted was that it wasn't visible from Paris, but that's not true. It would be visible regularly from the latitude of Paris, which is 49 degrees north. Even at the time Messier was compiling the first draft of the catalogue in the winter of 1770, 1771, the double cluster would have been visible low down in the evening sky. So more than likely the double cluster was omitted because it was too well known. It was on all the charts that Messier consulted, and it was more than likely too well known. But at the end of the day, Messier was only looking at compiling stuff that wasn't comet-like. He wasn't trying to compile deep sky objects for their own sake. They were of no interest to him. He was really just compiling a list so that he wouldn't mistake, and others wouldn't mistake, comets for these objects that were fixed in the sky. Messier, I'd mentioned the quality of Messier's telescopes, and certainly that would have hobbled him, but also the observing conditions. The Hotel de Cluny was not far from the center of Paris, which was one of the most populous cities in the world at the time. It had a population of 800,000 people, and the sky conditions probably were not great because of the air pollution in the city and the fact that the streets and squares were lit at night by gas lamp or by oil lamps. And although not the light pollution that we suffer in cities, certainly the, the city skies that Messier would have enjoyed would not have been very good quality. And that's why some objects probably did look cometary to him, whereas if he had just gone out into the countryside and observed, he would have been able to make out distinctive structure in certain clusters. They reckon the skies Messier had were probably no better than magnitude 5, which comparable to suburban skies in small towns. So it wasn't the pristine skies that we might have imagined. Messier, I guess you would call him the first comet hunter. Of the 50 comets that would have appeared during Messier's time observing, he observed 44 of them. He discovered 13 and co-discovered 7. And some of the comets are quite interesting. He discovered Lexell's comet, for example, which made the closest approach of any comet ever, but eventually was perturbed by the planet Jupiter. Another object that he found would have been he would have found a comet he found in 1769 was found in the year of Napoleon's birth. And towards the end of his life, Messier produced a pamphlet which attempted to link the appearance of that very bright comet with the birth of Napoleon. It probably was more an attempt to curry favor with the French leader, because at that stage Messier's circumstances had changed and he was very much reliant on help from others. And by trying to curry favor with Napoleon, he was probably hoping to regain the glory he once had. But it was an interesting aside, and some at the time said a blot on his record as an observer, that he was attempting to use astrology as an astronomer to try and get some benefit. I mentioned about the academies that Messier was elected to in his lifetime, but he suffered some tragedy in his life. In November 1770, he married a lady that he had known for about 15 years. A year and a half later, a son was born to them, but tragically, both died about a fortnight afterwards due to a fever Messier's wife contracted during the birth. At this stage, Messier had moved, his wife had moved out of the College Royal and were actually living in the Hotel de Cluny, just meters from the observatory, so he could essentially observe any clear night just by walking down the corridor from his accommodation to the observatory itself. It was also around this time that Messier was introduced to Pierre Méchain. Méchain had first started off as a hydrographer with the Department of the Navy, but eventually through his computational work, he became known to Messier. A number of the comets that Messier found, he passed on the details to Messiaen, and he calculated the orbits from that. They met each other through Joseph Lalande, who at this stage had become head of the Department of the Navy, and the two got on well together, worked well together, and as Messiaen was observing the sky, he came across various comet-like objects, the fuzzy patches that Messier was interested in, and passed on the details of those to Messier, who promptly incorporated them into the next versions of his catalogue. The catalogue, the final version of the catalogue was published in, well, there was two releases in quick succession. The first version had 68, or first version had 45 objects. The second version increased that number to 68. It was published 9 years after the first one. And then within a year, there was a significant number of new objects added, many of them found by Messiaen, and they ballooned the numbers up to 103 objects by 1781. So that chart there from the book, The Search for the Nebulae by Kenneth Glenn Jones, shows the gradual development. And many of these were not found by deliberate search. They were found while following comets. Some of the comets, for example, passed through the area of the Virgo cluster, and that's where Messiaen made a significant number of discoveries. I can hardly do better than quote directly from Wikipedia on this slide. When we ask why is the Messier catalogue important, it's important because it comprises nearly all the most spectacular examples of the main types of deep sky objects visible from European latitudes. They're also, all the Messier objects are amongst the closest to Earth in their various classes. For example, the Orion Nebula is the closest star-forming region to Earth. The Pleiades are the closest star clusters. Messier 1, the supernova remnant, is out in a class of its own. The various planetary nebulae show spectacular detail through professional instruments. The galaxies that sprinkle the Virgo cluster are part of the closest supercluster to Earth. Also, our own local group is part of the Virgo supercluster. And then within like the Andromeda Galaxy, Messier 33 and Triangulum, again show incredible detail and have played significant part in the development of our understanding of the universe. For example, the discovery of variable stars in the Andromeda Galaxy showed that it lay beyond our own Milky Way and established the nature of galaxies. So there's all the Messier objects have significant importance in the development of our knowledge of the universe, and they continue to be heavily studied by professional astronomers to this day. When Messier published the final version of his catalogue, it found its way into the hands of William Herschel, who resolved to systematically survey the sky himself. He built a number of his own telescopes and significantly increased the number of deep sky objects known. in 17, Herschel and Messier had actually corresponded with each other. And in fact, when Herschel stumbled across a comet-like object in 1781, he forwarded his observations to Messier to follow up on. Messier passed on the observations to some others who worked out the orbit of the object that Herschel had found. Messier himself never did any calculations. He was just interested in observing. He got others, he worked with others on the actual calculations. And it was Messier's observations of Herschel's object that showed that the object he found was actually a new planet, the planet Uranus. So Messier played a significant part in confirming the existence of Neptune based on following up correspondence he had with Herschel. In the following years, the number of deep sky objects significantly increased as more systematic surveys took place, and also with improving instruments. And now, in Armagh Observatory, for example, we have, when Dreyer was director there, he developed the new general catalogue and its supplement, the index catalogue, which lists over 13,000 objects. So Messier's list, though, remains the standard in that, as I mentioned, it has a significant amount of objects that are easily observed and well observed. For amateur astronomers, there's a particular event that occurs around the spring equinox every year. That's what we call the Messian Marathon. And that occurs because of the fact that around the spring equinox, the sun sits on the border of Aquarius and Pisces, where there's very few, well, no prominent deep sky objects. All the Messier objects are scattered across the sky away from that point. And back in the 1960s, the American amateur astronomer Don Mackhouse conceived an idea of trying to observe all these objects in a single night. But the first attempts really didn't begin until the 1970s, and eventually observers managed to succeed in tracking down all 110 objects in a single night. And they, it's basically a dusk to dawn observing session, hence the name marathon. You find that you'll be sprinting along at times to try and get through areas such as the Virgo cluster. Your pace will slow down a bit and then it'll speed up again. You'll hit what's called the wall, where you're desperately trying to catch some of the objects that you want to see before the sky gets too bright. In fact, from Ireland, we can't see all of them because we're damned essentially by one being overwhelmed by twilight, and that's the globular cluster Messier 30 in Capricornus. The best we can see from here are 109 objects. And a good piece of software is MESMARA, which allows you to calculate the optimum dates. And you'll find when you graph it out, you'll find that there's actually a good opportunity falls towards the end, like the beginning of October right through to November, to see more than 100 Messier objects in a single night. Again, that's because the sun is in a particular part of the sky that is devoid of Messier objects. So you have a good opportunity to see more than 100 objects on other nights during the year other than the so-called Messian Marathon days. Shortly after publication of his, the third part of his catalogue, the one that numbered 103 objects, Messier had a very serious fall. He was walking with a friend of his through a park and noticed a door, and he decided to have a look in the building, but not realizing it was an ice cellar, and he plunged about 15 feet and broke his leg, broke his arm, and had a number of injuries that it took a year to recover from. And it meant that Messier never really returned to compiling an extension to his final catalogue. He had thought about it, but he never really got around to it. When he started back observing in 1782, he observed a transit of Mercury across the sun. In fact, that was kind of poetic in that one of the very first observations he recorded under Delisle was a transit of Mercury as well. But things were changing in France. The French Revolution in 1789 meant a significant change in Messier's life, and he was still living at the Hotel de Cluny, but with the revolution and the upheavals across France in 1794, the various academies were dissolved. That also meant the Department of the Navy was dissolved, and it meant Messier's income was no longer forthcoming. His pension dried up. He had no money to maintain the observatory, and conditions started becoming very bad for him. In fact, it was only through the support of friends that he was able to continue working and attending various meetings. A younger sister and brother had also moved to Paris to live with him at this time because he had got quite frail, and in fact, his last observations were made in 1808. He suffered a stroke in 1815 and needed a lot of care. He had failing eyesight as well from about 1812 onwards, and a couple of years before he passed away, he found it very difficult to write or even to read because of his failing eyesight. He eventually passed away on the night of April 11th, 1817, at the age of 87. Quite a good age for the time, especially considering the conditions that he had to endure towards the end of his life. At this stage, when Napoleon became emperor, he reopened the academies, and Messier rejoined the Academy of Sciences. He was awarded the Légion d'honneur in 1808. Messian had also fallen on hard times. He lost his estate, and his pension and income had dried up too. But Messian was made director of Paris Observatory in 1801. So things kind of looked up for them once the turmoil of the French Revolution was over and Napoleon began to reassert himself and reestablish the French, well, France as a country. Messier's legacy, while he was alive, the astronomer Lalande published a celestial globe in 1775 and devised a unique honor for Messier. He assigned a number of what are called unformed stars that are not parts of constellations. He collected together and created a constellation called the Harvest Guardian, or Custos Messium, for Messier in the sky. It was a unique honor for an astronomer of the time. Sadly, the constellation didn't last very long, although it endured on star charts in France up to the middle of the 19th century. The stars are now part of Cassiopeia and Cepheus, but you can see it there on a chart from the time. It's very near Camelopardus. And then there's another constellation there, the Reindeer, which no longer exists either. Messier is also commemorated by an asteroid in the sky, and also 2 craters on the moon that are each about 15 kilometers in diameter. But what's unique about them is that they have a ray system jutting out to one side, rather like a comet tail. So it's a very nice commemoration of Messier and the moon. But Messier's legacy, though, overall, I think, is the fact that he essentially loved the sky at the end of the day, just as we do. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Thank you very much, John. Like a lot of us, I've read a fair bit about Messier, but it's refreshing to hear someone talk about him. But take it, you'd be happy to answer a few questions. There's a few there.
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay, pull up the first one. Is from Michael McCreary, I think it is. Michael, are you there?
Sorry, yeah. John, sorry, I was just wondering there.